Welcome to the 2026 Todd Lecture Series. For those of you that don't know me, and I hope everybody in this front section here knows who I am, I'm Lieutenant General John Broadmeadow. I'm the 25th president of Norwich University, and I'm very happy. This is actually my first event where I get to MC the whole thing. So you're stuck with me for a few minutes up here as I kick this off and I run it. So this is our Todd Lecture Series. The Todd Lecture Series is named in honor of the late U.S. Army Major General and Norwich President Emeritus, W. Russell Todd, Norwich class of 1950, and his wife, Carol. In gratitude for their dedicated service to Norwich University and the Northfield community. This series is always free every year and open to the public, to our faculty, our staff, and especially our students, and to the greater Vermont community. Founded in 2008, the Todd Lecture Series is made possible by the generosity of Ellen and John Drew, the Todd's daughter and son-in-law, and the Drew Foundation. I'd like you all to please join me right now in applause for Ellen and John Drew and their commitment both to our university and to President and Mrs. Todd's legacy. So let me set some ground rules, okay? General Kelly has graciously offered to a question and answer session after his remarks. There are microphones, as you can see, positioned on either side of the auditorium. And so after he is done, when I give you the signal, I will invite all of you to line up if you desire to ask questions. We'll get through as many of those questions as we can until I call last question, and that will be the last question. All of you are invited to ask questions, but I will respectfully ask that you allow our students to get front of the line privileges and ask their questions first. So, before I introduce our speaker this evening, I'd like to honor a few distinguished guests. And this is always a tricky part, right? Because there's a lot of people in the crowd out here who are very distinguished people. And I don't mean to skip you, so I'm going to keep this, relatively brief. First off, I am very proud to acknowledge Governor Phil Scott, Vermont's 82nd governor, and the holder of an honorary degree in leadership, honorary doctorate from Norwich University, and last year's commencement speaker. Governor, welcome back to Norwich. It's really a privilege to have you here. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. And we've also got some members of the Norwich leadership. On the podium with me today is Mr. Al Gobey, the chair of our Board of Trustees, and his wife Kim is in the audience. And then also in the audience, somebody that I'd like to point out is Mr. Mark Young, the chair of Norwich University's Applied Research Institute's Board of Directors. So, Mark, thank you for being here. Also, I am very pleased to have on stage with me two of my close partners, Dr. Leah Williams, our provost, and Brigadier General Bill McCullough, our commandant. As I've said, there are a number of other distinguished guests around the room, and Laura, my great executive assistant, most of you know Laura Mell, warned me today, sir, don't go around the room and point to people and say, hey, it's great to see you out there, because we'll be here forever. So I'm not going to do that. But if you are here, I genuinely appreciate it, and many of you do an awful lot for Norwich University. If I didn't call your name, please forgive me. But it is time to get on with the event. Before then, though, there is one last thing that I would like to do. To put an event on this like this requires an awful lot of work and logistics. Making sure that our guest speaker gets here and is appropriately treated. But there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work that goes on to coordinating these kinds of events. At this point, I'd really like to especially recognize Megan Liptak. Megan, you're probably hiding in the back of the auditorium. It's dark up there. There you go. Raise your hand. So everybody, please join me in a round of applause for Megan Liptak. So, well done, Megan. I've watched you pull this together for months now, and I genuinely appreciate it. So let me turn to the purpose for this evening and introduce our 2026 Todd Lecture Series speaker. I asked General John Kelly to consider offering his views on American citizenship for two reasons. First, citizenship is the foundation of Norwich's mission. When you read our mission statement, that is what it is all about. We are here to make sure that our students are ready for the responsibilities of a citizen of this free republic. Secondly, and maybe more pertinently, I honestly know of no one who has exemplified the life of a citizen leader for our country more than General John Kelly. General Kelly was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, began a career of public service when he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, hoorah, in 1970. He served as an infantryman with the 2nd Marine Division and was discharged as a sergeant, earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Massachusetts, and commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in the Marine Corps in 1976. For the next several decades, he led the quintessential career of an accomplished Marine infantry officer, serving in all of the key command and staff billets, attending and teaching at our professional military schools. He had command of the 1st Light Armored Reconnaissance Battalion, and he attended the National War College in Washington, D.C. All what you would expect of a Marine officer. But it was after that tour at the War College that his career took somewhat of a non-traditional term, if I could call it that, where after graduation he was selected to serve as the Commandant of the Marine Corps' liaison officer to the House of Representatives. He followed that assignment up with the assignment as the Special Assistant to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe in Mons, Belgium. These tours reflected the future roles of the intersection of military leadership, national policy, and legislative affairs. Later, as a general officer, those roles included assignments as legislative assistant to the Commandant of the Marine Corps and deputy legislative assistant to the Secretary of the Navy, essentially representing the Department of the Navy to our United States Congress. As a 3-star general, he served as the senior military advisor to the Secretary of Defense, providing advice to both Secretaries Robert Gates and Leon Panetta, putting him at the forefront of a wide range of defense and national security issues at our highest level. In between those strategic assignments, it was on multiple combat tours with 1st Marine Division following the attacks of 9/11 that I had the privilege to serve closely with General Kelly. So, I hope you'll forgive me here for a little bit, and let me tell one short sea story. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Marine vernacular, a sea story is a personal reflection that may possibly morph over time as, the sands of time make things a little bit fuzzy. It may get embellished a little bit. And I go into this fully knowing that the worst enemy of a sea story is to have a witness. But I'm sure that General Kelly will vouch for this story's veracity. Like all good sea stories, this one starts with, so there we were. We were in the northern Kuwait Desert on the early evening following the start of 1st Marine Division's attack into Iraq on our way to Baghdad. Then Colonel, Brigadier General Select Kelly, our assistant division commander, literally grabbed me and said, "Hey, John, let's go drive up to the division forward command post tonight." Now, they're on the other side of the border in Iraq. So he said it as if we were going out for a Sunday drive instead of moving up to the forward edge of a recently commenced combat operation. So off we went. And when we hit the inevitable backup of combat units pressing their way forward to the front line, Colonel Kelly suggested in his infinite wisdom, after looking at a map with his infantry eye skills, and decided we were going to take this little unmarked road that was on the map because it kind of sort of looked like it was heading in the direction that we wanted to go. I couldn't even recognize it as a road. But even then, we knew that no one in the division knew where we were. Yet off we headed down that road. So after a night of wandering the back roads of southern Iraq in the middle of combat operations, with me hoping that some Marine aircraft didn't mistake us for some wayward Iraqi units, we made our way to the Division Forward Command Post. And one of the things that I will always remember is pulling in about dawn, and right behind us comes rolling General Mattis. And many of you know, I hope know, who General Mattis is. He was our commander of the 1st Marine Division. And when he got there, he got out of his Humvee, and he had with him a red flag with a star on it and a couple of stars on his pocket, and I got to witness Colonel John Kelly get promoted to Brigadier General on the first day of combat operations on the other side of that Iraq border. I have a feeling he was the first American general ever promoted in the country of Iraq. So. In all, we spent 3 combat deployments together where General Kelly's dynamic and brave leadership saw Marine Corps joint multinational forces through some of the most tumultuous periods of Operation Iraqi Freedom. In 2012, he was promoted to the rank of general and assumed command of United States Southern Command. And if you pay any attention to the news today, you understand that Southern Command is in the news an awful lot. He was responsible for U.S. military engagement, security cooperation, and strategic partnerships across Latin America and the Caribbean. He stepped down from that command in January of 2016 and retired shortly thereafter, after nearly 45 years of service to our Marine Corps. Following his retirement from active military service, General Kelly continued to serve in many senior civilian leadership roles. He was confirmed by the Senate as the 5th Secretary of the Department of Homeland Defense in January 2017. Leading the department during a period of complex domestic and international security challenges. Later that year, President Trump appointed him to be the White House Chief of Staff, a position he held until January of 2019. Now, holding these billets of national import by themselves mark him as an American citizen of high stature. But I'd like to wrap up this introduction with some personal reflections on the character of our speaker tonight. He is a man of deep learning. General Mattis, himself a renowned, voracious reader, has publicly said that John Kelly is more widely read than anyone he knows. He is brave and selfless. I've witnessed his physical courage on the battlefield, and perhaps more importantly, his moral courage in dealing with the issues of great import to this nation while keeping his honor clean. He is the epitome of a servant leader. Not only have I been the beneficiary of his mentorship, but I have numerous colleagues who count themselves fortunate to have been led by General Kelly. John and his wife Karen have done more than just devote themselves to our nation's cloth. They have personally sacrificed it deeply. Their son Robert gave his life in combat in Afghanistan, serving our nation. John and Karen have channeled their grief into caring for countless wounded service members and Gold Star families, speaking on their behalf in national and international forums, providing support born from personal knowledge of the cost of war. His career, and indeed his entire life, reflect a sustained commitment to leadership, civil-military relations, and the constitutional privileges that underpin democratic governance. Values closely aligned with the mission of Norwich University and the enduring purpose of the Todd Lecture Series. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome for General John Kelly.
Thanks very much, John. I didn't know any of that. Thanks. I'll start off with some comments and start by saying it is really a privilege to be here. I was actually here in this very room delivering a different kind of speech about 14 years ago. Don't know how I get in, but I was still on active duty, and I came to talk about the wars that were at the time raging in Iraq and Afghanistan. But a little bit about myself, and something I'm very proud of. I come from Boston. I grew up in a very working class family in Boston. In growing up in the 50s and 60s, when I grew up, virtually every man in my life was a veteran. Veteran of World War I, and we were closer to the end of World War I back then when I grew up than we are today at the end of the Vietnam War. So it was a relatively recent event, World War I. And then, of course, the World War II, most of the veterans were from World War II, and then an awful lot of them, their little brothers, if you will, that had served in Korea. We paid a price in those battles. And in World War I, we lost 117,000 Americans. In World War II, nearly 500,000. In the Korean War, 36,000. In the Vietnam War, 58,000. But back to my being a kid, those young men, mostly young men that came back from the war, the only thing they wanted to do was to forget about it because it was so terrible, get a job, have a family, and basically be left alone, which is something that's pretty consistent among Americans. In my world, growing up as a kid, you were expected to serve because of this relationship or this contact you had with your dads, your uncles, virtually everyone having served in those wars. In my case, I always wanted to be a Marine. My dad was drafted into the U.S. Army during World War II, served in combat in the Pacific. But for some reason, I wanted to be a Marine. And when I went down and took my draft physical, people say, how come you joined at all? Well, we used to have the draft back then. It's gone now, but that kind of motivated young men to go down and take their physicals. But I went down and took the physical, and I was ready, all set to go in the Marine Corps. And when I finished, as I'm taking the physical, there's a lot of guys that were there, when you're taking your physical, there were 600 or 700 other young men, and they strip you down to your underwear. You spend the whole day, it's really weird, in your underwear with people that you don't even know. And then at the end of it, you get dressed. But I noticed a lot of the young guys were carrying paperwork. And I thought, oh my gosh, have I forgotten something? Am I going to get in trouble? So at the end of it, we all get dressed, and they say, okay, all of you that have doctor's letters to get out of the draft, go ahead and go down this hallway, and the rest of you go down this hallway. And the rest of us that went down the hallway, you sit down with a doctor, and you get about a 90-second review of your physical and whether you're qualified or not. So I go down there, and the doctor says to me, I have really good news for you. This is a federal employee. 1970, we were desperate for men to go into, particularly the Army and the Marine Corps because of the war in Vietnam. He said, I got great news for you. You're not qualified to go in the armed forces. And I just couldn't believe it. I said, well, again, a very working class background. So my initial sense was, I'll bribe this guy, because that's what you do in the cities. But then, as a working class guy, suddenly I quickly realized I don't have any money to bribe this guy. But I said to him, what's wrong with me? And he said, well, your eyes are correctable at 20/20, but uncorrected without glasses, you're way outside, and you have bone spurs. And I said, bone spurs? What are bone spurs? And he explained that to me. And I said, is there any way I can appeal this? And he said, I mean, no disrespect to the Army. You want to go in the Army? I said, no, I don't want to go in the Army. I want to go in the Marines. But yeah, I want to serve my country. And so he signed off, and I went in the Marine Corps a week later. When you look at our history, and I don't mean the revisionist kind of rewriting of our past to accommodate something that I don't understand, this July will mark the 250th anniversary, and you know this, of when the British colonists, our forefathers and mothers, when they decided enough was enough, we're not going to be in the British Empire anymore. And that came as a result, as you all know, for a number of different reasons, one of which was the way the colonists were treated, the unjust taxation, the way the British Army regulars treated the colonists, particularly, well, the way they treated the colonists. And all of that led to a decision on the part of most of the colonists, led by the so-called founders, but to break ties with Britain and go their own way. All of this, in fact, men like Jefferson, Franklin, you know the names, Madison, Jay, Adams, Washington, they all took the actions, spoke the words and took the actions to make the break and to take on the British Army that at the time was the most formidable fighting force on the planet. You're talking about, at the time, we didn't have an army, we had militia, which is very different, particularly back then, of what an army is. But they decided to take on the British Army, and we defeated them. We, the colonists, defeated them with help from the French, but pretty much we did it. We, the colonists, our forefathers and mothers. At Yorktown, the final battle, October 81, and then the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty in 1783. In nearly just about 2 years after the Declaration of Independence, which, as you know, was the document that began the process of us separating from the British Crown, and there were only about, well, not only, the majority of the colonists wanted to make the break, about 70%. The other 30% wanted to stay and did stay loyal to the Crown. But the Continental Congress adopted the so-called Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union in November of 1777. This document allowed the colonials to kind of stumble through, and I don't mean militarily necessarily, but to stumble through the war with Britain. We can go into that in the Q&A if you want. But the articles as adopted, and this is the very important part, it reflected the fears that were in the hearts and the souls of the colonists at the time. This treaty of friendship and cooperation was did not create a nation, but was among 13 sovereign states. It was a very, very weak arrangement. Individuals, as an example, had no right to vote. And this shouldn't surprise you, because the last time individuals had a right to vote was about 2,500 years before, during the Roman Republic. Rather, the way the articles worked, each colony got one vote, regardless of the size of the colony, and it required at least 9 of the 13 to pass any legislation. So you can imagine almost no legislation was ever passed. There was no executive branch, president, and there was no national court system. The articles had no power to tax or raise an army or regulate commerce or conduct foreign policy. To say the least, again, a very ineffective document, but it was the start. It was unclear, it was clear from the beginning, but especially after the war with England was over, that the articles were not going to do it. They were not in any way, shape, or form going to fix the problem in the future of the 13 colonies. Eventually, the decision was made to have a convention. They went back to Philadelphia, and from that convention, they developed what we know as today the Constitution of the United States. And even then, the Constitution of the United States, there was a lot of concern by many of the colonists that it was not strong enough to prevent their two number one fears: a president, or a better way to put it, a monarchy that was kind of a powerful man. They did not want that, because they saw that as one of the fundamental problems they had with England. And the other thing was a standing army. They were very, very afraid of a standing army. So they went back, continued to talk about it, put in the Bill of Rights, and that guaranteed things. The first 10 articles, they guaranteed things that the colonists now soon-to-be states felt as though they needed absolutely to have in writing. The first time, again in history, that there was anything like this, a document that formed a government. And what did it do? It created a number of things. It created an executive, 3 branches of government, theoretically separate but equal. Back in those days they were, not so much as much anymore, but the president, the Congress, and the courts. They went to great lengths to create this legislature that would be able to control the single president, because they were so afraid, again, of moving back as many efforts in self-government to move back to where men took over and, kind of reestablished a monarchy or something like that. There's 3 separate but equal parts of the government. During the period this went on, as I say, there were many fears to be dealt with, and it was this issue of a strong man monarchy and a standing army. And what's interesting is, and you may or may not know this, but towards the end of the Revolutionary War, George Washington, and thank gosh we had him, George Washington, his officers, senior officers got together, and they wanted to go to Philadelphia and take over and disestablish the Continental Congress, and for Washington to take over as kind of a semi-monarchy. And of course he said no. And he said, we as military people will not get involved in politics. And that is something that today, he set the tone, and that is something today we as citizens have a great deal of appreciation for, because we have never, hardly, ever got involved in politics, and Mr. Washington started it. And what's interesting, again, about the presidency, and I learned this more from when I worked at the White House, as I was researching some things that I was somewhat disturbed about. But presidents, if you read their memoirs, or if you read the interviews after they leave the White House, one of the things, they all say it, and this goes back at least 100 years, Democrat, Republican, they all say it. They were so surprised at how little power they actually had, that the Constitution really bound them in anything they wanted to do. In almost every case, they had to go to the Congress to either ask for legislation or ask them to fund it. But it was designed that way by the brilliant men who we call the founders that wrote the Constitution. And it's, again, I remember listening to Mr. Obama talk about it. He was just shocked at how little power he actually had because of the constitutional requirement for the president to interact with the Congress on almost all issues. And in Article 1 of our Constitution, it ensures that the president, as commander-in-chief of the military, needs congressional approval to employ the force, to send it to war, because only the Congress can raise and support an army, maintain a navy, call out the militia to execute the laws of the Union, and declare war. So those of us in the military kind of had 2 bosses, Commander-in-Chief, the President, and Congress. In short, the President cannot command a military that doesn't exist, and only the Congress can make the military exist. Again, the checks and balances that the founders were so brilliant in putting into the Constitution. And still, since we become a country in 1789, 42 million Americans have in fact died in combat. Have served the nation in uniform, and 1 million have lost their lives. But we owe so much of this to George Washington, who himself realized how important it was for him to, in a very real sense, to lead the way. One of the things, I speak at Mount Vernon, and I said the 2 things we owe George Washington the most for as Americans. And people say, well, a lot of different things. He went home twice. And that set the precedent for the rest of us, for the rest of our history. He went home when, at the end of the Revolutionary War, civilians as well as his own officers said, "Why don't you stay on board as kind of a monarchy, as kind of a king?" And he said, "Nope, time to go home. We didn't fight for this." And then the second thing, we owe him for is he went home when he was the president. 2 terms, they wanted him to stay in power at the end of his second term and kind of become somewhat of a monarchy, and he said, "No, time to go home." And he set the precedent that, existed right up until today, that the military is apolitical, serves the nation, serves the Constitution first and foremost, and set the precedent for 2 terms. I mean, FDR stayed a little longer, but there's the Congress passed, or there was an amendment restriction to 2 years. You all know that. All of this is, monumental in its own right, but all of it went to a large degree to safeguard the future of our nation. But there's one hugely big part of the Constitution that is oftentimes, whether you're a history major or just go to lectures, there's one big part of the Constitution that is monumental, and again has made us a different group of people than has existed certainly since the Roman Republic 2,500 years ago. It created a democracy that made every American citizen with defined rights and protections as opposed to being the subject of a king in his court. Democracy, a form of government, as I say, that has not done very well prior to 1789 when our country became a democracy and we moved forward. It did not do very well through history. The Constitution sets the tone. In its first words, it says, "We the people." The most important part of our democracy, of our government, are the people. We the people. Then in the same sentence, it sets out to define what the people or citizens' responsibilities are. And those responsibilities are, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, I've taken an oath to the Constitution 21 times as I get promoted, because you take the oath every time when you first come in the armed forces and every time you get promoted. We are the only country that takes an oath to a piece of paper. If you are a British official, military person, and you take an oath, you take it to the monarchy, to the king. If you are French, you take it to the people. If you're Chinese, Chinese Communist Party. We take it, again, to a piece of paper. That's the driving force of everything we are as a government, or should be. That said, interesting story, when they were about to swear George Washington in as our first president, I think it was Adams, said, "Gee, don't we need an oath?" Because they'd all been used to take an oath, to the King of England. So he sat down and wrote an oath, and they gave it to George Washington, and the only thing he added was, "So help me God," at the end, which, again, set a certain tone and precedent. If you haven't figured it out yet, most of our countrymen and women seem to miss the point today, that they are the most important part of our government. And whether our government fails or succeeds or fails has a lot to do with how much we as citizens are involved in it. Not the president, not the Congress, they work for us. By definition, they work for us. It is the citizenry, you, that carries the responsibility and the success of this entire process we call America. It's based on a level of our active participation and involved in informing our officials as to what we want going forward. The reality, and I think you will agree, is that all too often we as citizens are concerned with other things and get distracted or get frustrated. But at the end of the day, we are in charge. And we exercise that through our votes and through our being outspoken, not disrespectful, but outspoken about things that are pending in the government in order to get our elected officials to do what we want them to do. And of course, the execution of the various governmental actions are performed by the federal, state, and local government bureaucracies and the elected officials. But again, it's our responsibility as citizens, each and every one of us individually, to send the best people to represent us in Washington or in Montpelier. And who are the best people? I think the founders' assumption, way back in the late 1700s, their assumption was that we would look for men and women of character, of ethics, integrity, and morals, before we ever looked at their political views. For me as a citizen, when I think of the process, the first thing that comes to my mind is, I want to ask someone who's running for office, why do you think you're good enough to represent me? My community, my family. And if elected, will you work to better our nation, to represent all of the constituents in your state, in your district? I don't care other than that they go there and they represent all of us. I would ask them will they live up to their constitutional responsibilities and work tirelessly to bring us all together and do the right thing, even though it may impact your re-election bid. A huge part of this responsibility as citizens is to work hard to stay on top of and work to understand the issues. That's why the Constitution gives us a press, so that we can become informed. Now, that said, it's hard because the press is turned into, in many cases, very partisan. Not bad people, but they do have their perspective and write that perspective. But we as citizens should work very hard to be informed. So if you love Fox News, also listen to CNN. If you loved, the New York Times, also read the, another type of. If you get your information from blogs, just don't listen to one blog. It's very important that we as citizens understand the issues so that we can help our elected officials make a decision to do the right thing for our country. Never miss an opportunity, in my opinion, to ever go, and the politicians do it, all at every level. They will have town hall meetings. Go to the town hall meetings, particularly if the members there are his staff, and listen to them and not be disrespectful, not, squirt, salad dressing on them or something, but to listen to them and to challenge them. Not in a disrespectful way, but to say, okay, what are you doing about this problem, whatever that problem might be, whatever you're interested in. That's what you're supposed to do when you're a citizen. Back when I was still on active duty in 2013, I spoke at a leadership conference down in Miami, and I pointed out to the group that the U.S. military, almost for our entire history, but certainly in the modern era, in the last 50 years, 50 years, the U.S. military has been considered by our citizens the most admired, the most respected, and effective institution in our country, the U.S. military. This opinion, for decades, was at the 80-plus percentile level. We've lost a little bit, still number one, but lost a little bit in the last 4 years, but it's come back up a little bit. This in spite of the fact, by the way, that only about 1% of our citizens serve. In fact, the reality is most Americans don't know anyone that has served. And right behind us as military, or you as, in many cases as military people, is law enforcement, first responders. They are the most respected and throughout our population, the most respected people. At a post-discussion event that I did with the press, one of them asked me, wasn't it dangerous that in a democracy, the military is so revered, as are the police? And I disagreed with the member, or with the member of the press. And I said it was clear our citizenry appreciated their fellow citizens that decided to serve the country, take on a tough challenge, protect them and their families and our way of life. and in the process, very possibly losing their own lives. That our American citizens appreciated that, and that's why they look at us and revere us in the way that they do. And this is something, again, that was started by George Washington. And we stayed out of the military, as very much stayed out of politics. But I said to her, I think what is very dangerous to our democracy is that, in my view, the people that should be considered probably the number one people are the Congress, because they represent us and our elected officials. Our Congress is last. The least respected institution in our country is Congress, and that's to a large degree because we as citizens look and say they're not carrying the ball, they're not being effective. I know a lot of politicians. I've had a lot of experience with politicians. They're not bad people, but sometimes they forget who they serve, and they go about doing things that are good for the party or for their re-election campaign, but they should be held accountable. And that's why I say never miss an opportunity to engage with the elected officials, because they work for you. And the other thing about service members, in the high regard that Americans hold them in, is also when they leave the service, they continue to serve. I spoke to about 500, a number of years ago, when I was at the Department of Homeland Security, I spoke to about 500 volunteer firefighter chiefs from all over the country. And you may or may not know, but the vast majority of firefighters in America, about 85%, are in fact volunteers. They don't get paid. They take time out of their own lives to get qualified to be firefighters and EMTs, emergency medical technicians. And then they sign up for a day or two or three every month to stand by and to help Americans that need help. About 500 of them. In the course of talking to them, I just this volunteerism thing struck me. And I said, just out of curiosity, how many of you, coach Little League? And about well over half of them raised their hand. I said, that's interesting. How many of you are involved in Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts? Half of them raised their hand. How many of you volunteer to help kids that are having trouble in school be better at mathematics or reading or something? Half of them raised their hand. I said, how many of you are veterans? And over half of them raised their hand. So this idea of continuing to serve, and you don't have to be a veteran to do this, you should find ways, citizens should find ways, because we all have talents in certain areas, you should find ways to serve your country, your community. And again, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, soccer coach, whatever, there's many, many ways to do it. And I would highly recommend, because when you volunteer to help people, you'll never feel better about yourself. Hugely important. And as I said, when I talked to this member of Congress or member of the press, I said, I am concerned with the general opinion of Americans relative to the Congress, relative oftentimes to the president. As I said, the military is usually up around 80+%, law enforcement right behind them, high 70s. Supreme Court kind of right around 40s. Presidents are kind of in the 45 realm. The press is pretty low, 20s. But the Congress, once again, is disturbingly behind in the opinion of the Americans. I would offer to you that you are, I believe, very, very lucky to be attending an institution like Norwich. I know, just because I know, that you all naturally don't agree with each other on everything, but just from the 2 days now I've spent, a lot of discussion, a lot of Q&As. Clearly, people have questions, don't necessarily always agree, and that's okay. But you do respect your fellow students, in this case, their right to hold a separate opinion. And, very important, that they can express the opinion without being, chastised or whatever, neutered or something like that. But we as citizens have got to remember, and I know you all are exposed to this at Norwich, we've got to remember the things that we used to teach in civics classes in grade school, and what our grandparents, your grandparents, and great-grandparents knew, that our immigrant ancestors that came here to this country, many of whom came here in chains, they forged a nation that was a melting pot, and is a melting pot, I think, still, stitched together by a shared sense of freedom, personal responsibility, intense work ethic, self-reliance, never being a burden on society, who loves the fact of our history. It is so important to remember that about our country and about the people that have come here for so many different reasons over the last 200 years to become part of this great experiment we call America. In closing, I want to emphasize the issue of citizenship and for you to all get out of the house and find ways, as I've mentioned already, to serve your communities. You don't have to go in the military. There's police, there's nursing, there's cybersecurity. There's so many ways but the most important, in my view, are to find ways within your communities to interact with people, whether it's coaching Little League and all of that kind of thing. It's so incredibly important. A great man once said, and he gave his life for this country, it's not about color, but it's about character. And I would add to that, it's about you being understanding and sympathetic to your fellow citizens, and when they need help, for you to step forward and help them. There is an exceptionalism, in my opinion, about America. I've traveled to over 140 countries in my life, many of them multiple times. There ain't no place like this. People aren't breaking down the doors to get to most countries on the planet. They're breaking down the doors to come here. We are an exceptional country. We should cherish who we are and why we are extraordinary, and not fear for 1 second, or for not 1 second considering trading it all away. We are a great country, and we stand on the shoulders today of men and women that go back for at least 200 years that made this country what it is, and we should not forget that. And I think, John, I'll end with that, and about a half an hour, and then open it up to questions, I guess, right?
All right. I don't know if this one's working. There we go. All right, so we have microphones on either side. The general has graciously offered to take questions. Great talk about the responsibilities of citizenship and what it takes to be a good citizen. I had a lot of echoes in there, Governor, about your speech to us last year, that great graduation speech that you gave. So you've got a pretty highly qualified individual up here. But I think with General Kelly's experiences, it would be worthwhile asking some questions. So go ahead and line up, by the mics if you have a question. I'll open it up to anybody. But I'm going to start with one, sir,
okay,
if that's okay, while they're all thinking about what they want to ask. We've done a little bit of talking, you and I, over the years, about the nature of being a military officer, and you know my feelings on it. The more senior you get, it's wrong to say you're not political. But you should be nonpartisan, okay? You should be political in that we have to advance agendas, particularly in many of the places where we have to work. We have to pull coalitions together, and you have to do that whether you're in the military or in industry. But particularly for those of us that have served in the military, you've talked very eloquently before about what it's like to have to go across the river, if you will, to go from the Pentagon and into the halls of Congress, where you've spent a lot of time. Many of these young folks that you see sitting out here today will go and serve as military officers. Could you just talk a little bit about the differences and the things that they should be aware of as military officers, both their responsibility, but also how others, particularly in government service, may look at them and expect them to interact?
Well, I'd start by saying, the military is obviously very important. It's a big part of my life. It was my whole life. I had two sons in the military, both Marines. One was killed in Afghanistan a few years ago. One still is in the Marine Corps. But there are many other ways to serve. I mean, you can go into many government agencies, whether it's, the so-called three-lettered agencies, FBI and DEA and CIA and all that. And that's all good stuff, and you should think about that. But then again, you don't just have to do that. There are many ways. If you go into private business, there's many ways to continue serving. But I would tell you that the Marine or the Armed Forces isn't very much, it's very much a meritocracy. From the day you come in, you're being developed every day as a leader, but you're also being mentored, and you're being shown the way to be a better leader, but you're also being evaluated. And not everyone that joins makes major, or lieutenant colonel, or colonel, and certainly general. It doesn't mean those people that don't get that far are bad people, by no means. But you're being evaluated every step along the way. But it is a meritocracy, and it is also a little bit of a different world, motivated by different things. And as you get more and more senior, you start interacting with other parts of our government, Congress, White House, other parts like the State Department, Treasury Department, and all. But to focus more on, say, a lot of the elected officials, they look in the White House, they look at things through a different lens or a different filter. And they consider different things. Yes, if they commit the United States to armed conflict, they want to win, but they also are thinking about the impact on everything from re-election, because we have a 2-year cycle, president every 4 years, but in the off-year elections, like what's coming up. So they look at re-election, because you can't be a member of Congress unless you get re-elected. They think about party, the Republicans over the Democrats. And then within the parties now, you have people who are far right Republicans or far left Democrats. And you have to, as a military person, when you go over to talk to them and brief them on things, you just have to keep that in mind and help them understand that, okay, Mr. President or Congress, whatever, you've given me a mission. In order for me to accomplish that mission on the ground in whatever country you want to send me to, this is what I need. And frankly, this is what I need you to do. Because wars are, the military is only one aspect of a war. The rest of most wars have to do with, when you win them, if you win them, have to do with social development. I remember, going to Iraq, and I found them to be good people and all, but very different socially than certainly what I was used to as an American growing up. And they looked at things differently because of their culture and society. And I had to understand that and work with it. We were in the process of developing government in Iraq that would govern Iraq the right way. Wasn't really the military's job, but since no one else was doing it, we were doing it. And the people were very appreciative of the approach we were taking to help them fix their economy, fix their society, and all that. But, again, we really truly do have to look at the entire government, as we say, and understand that when you do go across the Potomac River to deal with them, they do look at things differently. They're not bad people, they're not unreasonable people, but they do have things that they look at that they're trying to accomplish first, and it's not always defeating the enemy. And we saw that in the Vietnam War, we saw that in the Iraq and Afghanistan War, to a degree in the Korean War. And as military people, John, it's a tough one to do, but when we are given a legal order, you do the bit, and we think it's not the most effective thing to do, we engage with the politicians, the president oftentimes. I did that myself as a 4-star, to go back and say, okay, Mr. President, I got you, but I think there's a better way to do it. And oftentimes they say, gee, you know more about it than I do. But at the end of the day, if they give you a legal order, as military people, you have to, even if you disagree with it, you have to obey it. just the way it is. And that's, again, the non-political nature of our military as first set forth by a guy by the name of Washington. And thank goodness we had him, because he really did set so many things politically as well as the military, and set us on the right course in terms of how we interact with our society. And again, I go back to this issue of the American public. The vast majority who don't serve and don't know anyone that serves know in their heart and in their soul that they thank us, and someday you perhaps, because we're willing to do what we do to protect them and their families. And again, as I told the media folks, I think there's a great wisdom in our citizens about how they look at their military. I just wish we would redouble our efforts to fix their impression of our elected officials. Not all the elected officials, but some of them. Good, John?
Mark, go ahead.
Sir, thanks for being here and for sharing your guidance with all of us. You mentioned following lawful orders for all of these young men and women who are about to take the oath that you discussed. What counsel would you give to them as junior officers? They're obligated to follow only lawful orders, but they don't have the experience that a senior officer has in thinking that the senior officer thinks that it's a lawful order. Maybe they might think that it's not. So what counsel do you give to them to say, hey, when you have a question, what do you do? Because you're obligated to only follow those lawful orders. And what if you think there is a problem with that when the person who's giving those orders clearly has more experience, clearly has more knowledge of what's lawful and what's not? So how do we help them solve that dilemma?
It's a great question. I mean, one of the things as a senior officer you have on your staff are a lot of lawyers. And I would not admit to this outside this group, but the most important people in my life as a general officer were the lawyers, because there are so many things that you might be ordered to do that I would have to ask my lawyers, do I have the authority to do them? Actually, a better way, there were things I wanted to do, and I would ask my lawyers, do I have the authority to do that? I don't want to break the law, and I don't want to tell you all as junior people to go out there. And oftentimes they said, no, sir, you don't have the authority. And it was the same when I worked at the White House. I mean, when the president wanted to do something, the first thing I did was have the lawyers come down to my office and say, okay, this is what he wants to do. Does he have the authority? And I go back to what I said a little earlier about the Constitution. It's drilled into written into the Constitution. The president doesn't have a lot of authority. He has to go to the Congress for funding or for permission. And I would say that I'd like to see Congress be a little bit more forward-leaning, and not just this Congress, but goes back. The president, one of the most important things a president can do is use military force against another country. Because at the end of the day, people are going to get killed. Our own people, but as well as people in that country. And regardless of what you see in movies and all that, it ain't fun to kill people. Even though they're bad people, and it ain't fun. I can tell you from personal experience. But so many of the possibilities of war that we face, the American public should be informed, because we're the bosses. You're the bosses. Should be informed and allowed to express their opinions. And how do you do that? Members of Congress go back to their districts or back to their states and say, okay, this situation we got going with whatever country, say Iran, and we got to do this and we got to do that. And they need to listen to people and explain to people why it's important that we might do something militarily against this country or that country. And those members of Congress, senators, congressmen, listen to that and take that feedback back to Washington to say, look, we need to, my folks out there in Burlington, Vermont, they ain't convinced. We need to explain better to them why it's very important for us to take these actions. That's the way it's supposed to work. And that's the way it has worked in the past, but not so much recently. And me as a military guy, I'll do what I'm told to do. But I would very much wish that there was much more, because at the end of the day, some of the things that could happen with China, Russia, Iran, the casualty levels for our country could be very high. And Americans should know that and understand what the risks are, and should be very much involved and essentially give their up or down thumb to what the president or whomever wants to do. But as far as the general giving of orders, one of the things, and this is a good thing, that our military junior members that don't have lawyers to call and say, hey, is it okay to do this? Their confidence that the senior officers would not give an order that was illegal. Some orders are very, very, on their face of, kill innocent people. No one would do that. No American would do that. But it's the other things about, and you read about them today, some of the things that the current administration do in Latin America. They're questionable as to whether, so the confidence that the junior people in the U.S. military have in senior officers, that they would not tell us to do this if it wasn't legal, because they got the lawyers. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I tried.
So I can't see on my left over here, but I do see some students lined up over here. So let's go ahead there, and then we'll go over to the left side next.
Again, there's not much of an obstacle because of the nature of the military. When a new person comes in, whether you're a private or a second lieutenant ensign, one of the things that the institution does, it's just what we do naturally, is help you develop into being a leader. So I was never really faced with, there's some tough things, particularly as you get more senior. I mean, I was told to do some things when I was a very senior officer, and it's tough, because we look at our president, every president, as being commander-in-chief and all, and it's tough to say, I need to see the president and explain to him that what I think his staff is advising him and telling me is not in the best interest of the president. And you get a lot of times when you're a senior officer doing this, that, or whatever, you get a lot of phone calls from the White House, hey, the president wants you to do this. And in the chain of command, my immediate boss, when I was a 4-star down in Southcom, my immediate boss was Secretary of Defense. And the only other person above him was the president. So I worked directly pretty much for the president. And when I would get a call from the White House, someone on the White House saying, hey, the president wants you to do this, if the issue was huge to me, I would call the Secretary of Defense, who was my immediate boss, and say, hey, I just get these calls from the White House. I don't think it's a good idea. And to their credit, I mean, they were great public officials, said, let me look into it and I'll call you back. It kind of goes against what most military officers do, because you want to salute and say, yes, sir. But there's some issues that, as I would say to people, if the president wants me to do this, have him give me a call. When I worked at the White House, knowing this and having had this experience, I told the White House staff, there's only one person in this building that can say the president wants this, and that's me. So if you ever call someone in our government and say, hey, the president wants you to do this, and I find out about it, you're gone, essentially. And you come and, yes, the president says stuff, just like the general says stuff, just like the boss. They say stuff, but it's not always what they really want. They may be, and that, working for the Trump administration and Mr. Trump, he knew what I was doing. And I said, boss, on some of these issues, if you want it done, call me. You should tell me, and I will pass that on to whoever. But no, we don't need. I mean, there's almost 3,000 people that work in the White House staff, and an awful lot of them feel as though, because they work at the White House and maybe heard the president say, "I want this or that," that they can just pick the phone up and say it. So, because some of these issues are massive and could impact our economy, or cause wars, and so. But back to your question, the institution really is very good at developing people, so that you don't really confront any huge challenges because you're learning every day. And you're not only just learning from your seniors who are officers, but the amount of wisdom that resides in the enlisted ranks, because they may be junior to you, sergeants and sergeants majors and petty officers, but they've got more experience than you. And a lot of times, more times than I care to remember, when I was a junior commander and the senior enlisted guy working for me comes in the room, closes the door, and says, "Hey, sir, I need to talk to you. This wasn't one of your best days, sir. Okay, what did I do wrong?" And listen to them, because you may be the 15th person they've worked for, and they're trying to give you their advice, the experience that they have. And so you hear it from people that are junior to you as well as people senior. Sure.
I can't see over on this side. Is there a student standing there? I want to give the students a chance to go.
Hi. Good evening. What would your advice be to the rising generation on navigating an ever-increasing political divide in the country?
Could you repeat? I didn't get all the words. Go ahead.
What would your advice be to the rising generation on navigating the political divide?
I think the solution is talk to each other and don't hate each other. I grew up in a very democratic household, working class, big time. There were different Democrats back then, and I had a couple of relatives that were Republicans growing up in Boston. I can remember not heated, but lively discussions over a couple of beers. I'd be a little boy sitting on the front stoop with them. But they didn't hate, my dad was a Kennedy Democrat. They didn't hate each other. They didn't, throw a glass of beer in someone's face and storm off. Talk to each other. We're not going to solve this divide issue unless we talk to each other. And if you hold some issue very, very strongly, I do it all the time, I make the assumption that I'm wrong, and I go back and get more information on it. And I'm usually right, but again, just because someone disagrees with you on whatever the issue is, it doesn't mean that you should hate each other and not talk. But again, I go back to, you're the bosses. And much of this, with all due respect to many of the elected officials at the national level, much of this is generated to their advantage because that's how they raise money for campaigns, and that's how they, but you are the boss. And as I say, never miss an opportunity to go down and talk, if the governor or the senator or whatever, and they're doing a town hall, never miss an opportunity to go down and ask questions. Unfortunately today, there's so often when they do these town halls, there's demonstrations, so no one gets to talk, or there's violence. That's not who we are. So that's what I would say. Talk to each other.
Let's go over here on my right, your left.
Good evening, sir.
Hi.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to come talk to us, and thank you for your service. My question was, when we first came to Norwich, we all had to write down like a why of why we came to the school, what we wanted to get out of it. And I was wondering, what was your why? I know you said that you felt like you were expected to serve, but after such a long career, did your why ever change or evolve to match like whatever job you were in at the time?
No, I get so much satisfaction out of serving. I really did. I got to tell you, my wife, couldn't have done it without her. She raised 3 kids, oftentimes by herself. Oftentimes, I think she drove cross-country by herself with 3 kids 5 times. And why did she drive across by herself? Because I would get orders from wherever, hey, you need to be there, whether it was Iraq or wherever, you need to be there in 3 days. And we're living, say, in California, we have a house to move, household effects, 3 kids, and I could leave, and she could make all the arrangements and drive cross-country with 3 little kids. It's an amazing woman. But I will say this, when I got a call, the way I went into the Trump administration, I'm watching, it was November after the 2016 election, when he was first elected, and I got a call from the administration. It was late in November. I'm watching college football, and I got a call Reince Priebus, who was going to be the first chief of staff, called, and I'd never heard the guy's name before. I had no association of any kind with the Trumps. I didn't know anything. I didn't know anyone that was working for him. But I got a call, and he said, would you consider coming into the administration in some capacity? And once, once I was convinced this wasn't a bot call, I said, sure, what's the president-elect thinking about? I said, I would not be interested really in being in the State Department, but no, it's not state, he's got a couple of other ideas. And I said, sure, I'd consider doing it. Now, my wife is hearing one side of this conversation, and I was just less than a year retired from 45 years in the Marine Corps, and I, when I hung up, they were going to send an airplane. I said, no, I'll drive up to New Jersey and do the interview tomorrow. But when I hung up, my wife, who'd heard half of this, just one side of the conversation, said, what was that all about? And I told her, and I said, what do you think? And now she's from New Jersey, so she's a little different. So she said, well, if our family's nothing else, we're a family of service. And so if they think they could use you, then you ought to go up and at least have the interview. And then she added, and besides all of this really quality time we're spending together in retirement, not so much. So that's how I started off, but that's how it was, the service. And when I left the military, I had job offers and all of that, big money and all that, and I was very uninterested in it, because it's in your DNA to serve. And most people that leave after, well, if they're in for 4 or 5 years or they do a career, you do miss it. So that's why I certainly have tried to continue. And even after leaving the White House, teaching at the War Colleges, teaching at fundraisers for military or veterans causes, it's the least I can do to give back, or try to give back. Sure.
Hey, Dan, let me get through a couple of students more, so go ahead, over here.
Good evening, sir. Just want to say thank you for coming out here to Norwich, and thank you for your service before I ask the question. Cadet Private Nelson. I was going to ask, how can we as people living in small towns and everyday life navigate through moral right and wrong, through political unrest in our day, and what can we as small town people do about it?
Vote. As I say again, that's what we do. Vote, and try to encourage your elected officials to take your message back to Washington. One of the things, and again, I guess I am criticizing, but they're not necessarily bad people. But when you run for office, and you're a Democrat, and you get elected, you go to Washington, or for that matter, you're the governor of the state or whatever, you have to remember, you represent every single American, every single person in your district, even the ones that didn't vote for you. That's your job. And yes, you ran on a certain set of issues, but at the same time, you got large percentage of people in your district or in your state that didn't vote for you, but you are by definition their representative or their senator. And they need to remember that. The other thing I think that's a fairly new phenomenon last, 10, 12 years is people get elected and go to Washington and then push their personal politics and forget about the people back in the district. And they've got to be reminded, no, you represent the district. Well, big town or little, big city or little town, I think you have to convince your members of Congress, your elected officials, that they do indeed work for you, and they should follow through on their constitutional responsibilities and do that.
Good. Let's get one more cadet over here, and then Dan, I'll come over to you after that.
Sir, thank you for coming by to Norwich. My question is, what do you think is the most important characteristic or value that an individual American can have?
Well, I mean, I mean, certainly their families are, important, but if you take that personal stuff off the table, as I say, I go back to this issue of the Constitution gave all of us responsibility to do things. We think of it, okay, says the president does this, the Congress does that, but the overall document says we are the ones that are in charge. And that we need to remember that. And I know it's frustrating because, frankly, most people as they get older, families and all that, they get busy. They can't pay as much attention. They do look at what's going on in Washington and shake their head. But no, they should not give up. They should continue to be engaged with their elected officials. And frankly, run for office yourself, whether it's local office at the school, district or whatever they call it, or president. Run for office yourself. I think if we had more people that did not see themselves as professional politicians, but people that do want to go there and help advance the ball, I think we'd be better off. And again, most people that do run for office and are in power, they're not bad people. But it does, the system takes over, and again, the system is re-election, party. One of the things back when we were just starting out as a nation, the founders, one of the things they thought would be the biggest negative impact on this thing we would call democracy was parties. And within 4 years, we fell into separate parties, Federalist, Anti-Federalist, that kind of thing. And so, and that does tend to dictate what the discussion is going to be. But when I was working years ago, back in the late 90s, when I worked on Capitol Hill, I would go on, at the request of members of Congress, I would put together trips around the world. And the thing I remember is the people that we would go on trips with, that I'd take on trips to, wherever, the Middle East or whatever, they got along. Republicans and Democrats, they traveled together, shot the breeze, talked to each other, watched movies together, and I'd take them to this place or that place for business, and they got along. Interesting, I had a conversation, he happened to be a former Marine, he's dead now, but Jack Murtha from Pennsylvania, and he, very senior, very influential, he was at the time, the chairman of the House Defense Appropriations. Big deal, really big deal. And I was taking him somewhere, and he said to me, he's a good guy, but very working class kind of guy, which is very positive in my mind. But he said, and back then, the Congress got together or got along much better than perhaps now. But he said, you know what has killed us in terms of the people arguing in the Congress? And I said, no, what's killed us? Commercial aviation. And I wasn't expecting that. And I said, how did commercial aviation do this? He said, well, years ago when he first started, this conversation was in like 96, and he'd been in Congress at that point almost 30 years. He said, before, when we were elected and we came to Washington, it was not all that easy to go back to our districts. And so we were here in Washington, and we played golf together, went out to have dinner because their families were there. They went to their sons and daughters' bar mitzvahs or christenings, weddings, and they got to know each other really well. And when you get to know people, it's hard to point at them and make enemies out of them. Fast forward, and it's nothing like it is today, but they were members, and they were good people, but they were members. Almost every member would go back to their district on Thursday afternoon, and then they'd come back on Tuesday for votes. And Neil Abercrombie, his name was, he was the Democrat from Honolulu. Great guy, politically not my guy, but he went back to Honolulu every weekend. And so fly from DC to LA, and what's that, probably 12 hours of flight time, something like that. He went back every weekend. And when they do, they go back and do the meetings with constituents and all that. And the rationale is we go back so that we can find out what our constituents want And most of them do that, have town hall meetings and meet with business leaders and all that kind of thing. But that was Jack Murtha's theory, that when became so easy to travel to the districts, we were spending less and less time together in Washington, and consequently, we didn't get to know each other as well anymore. Just a thought. Not mine, his.
Okay, I want to try something. We've got about 5 minutes left. I see 3 people standing up here, and I want to get all the questions in. So what I want you to do is ask your question as succinctly as possible, and I'm going to have you ask all 3 questions before the general answers, and we're going to give him an opportunity to shape the answers to try and get at all of them. So go ahead over here first.
First off, good evening, sir. Thank you for your service. I was wondering how you handle, in time-sensitive situations, how do you handle making the perfect plan, making like the perfect choice, versus making a timely one? Like, how do you handle gathering information? How much is too much? How much is just enough? And then just how do you manage those situations?
Okay. Dan, let's go.
Hi, my name is Dan Cox. I'm class of 71. I think a lot of us feel our democracy is under threat right now. Do you think the threat is internationally, China, Iran, Russia, Cuba, or do you think it's internally, right wing, left wing, the media, Citizens United? So I think what my question is, how do you feel our democracy is today? Is it under threat? And if it is, from where?
Good. Okay. And the last one over here.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for your service. My question to you is, as somebody who spent 40-plus years in the Marine Corps, what qualities do you think make the Marines such a proficient and feared fighting force compared to other branches and services in the military?
Hey, just out of curiosity, what branch of the service are you going into?
What a kiss ass, huh? The questions are pretty different. I'll start with the democracy one. You know, remember when the Constitution was signed and we actually became a nation in 1789, Ben Franklin was asked, do we have a republic? We really don't have a true democracy. We are really a republic. But they said, do we have a republic? And he said, yes, if we can keep it. They were concerned about the failure of our system of government from within. And the big concerns, as I've mentioned a couple of times, was a president that got too powerful or a standing army and the generals take over. That was their greatest concern, and they wrote the Constitution and put in the checks and balances to control that. I don't think our democracy is I mean, it is an experiment. Every day is different. I do think, though, let me say, it's less efficient if the power is all centralized inside Washington than if it's truly where it should be, and that is out here in Burlington or wherever we are. Vermont, I'm sorry, Vermont. And at the end of the day, Americans, I mean, who said it? Democracy is absolutely the worst form of government, except for all the rest of them. I think Churchill said that. So I think it's more of the efficiency of the system because so much of the power is back in Washington. And when they do come back out here, they don't maybe listen as much and take the message back. But I'm not in fear that it's going to collapse or anything like that. The good news is, I say, we've got great people, police and people like that, military, to protect it. As I always said when I worked at DHS, you have tremendous Americans that protect our country in the home game here in America, and tremendous Americans that protect our country in the away game. And the good news is, from the 9/11 period, they're talking to each other, coordinating with each other, making sure the physical threats against our country can be managed and stopped. And I can't tell you the number of, I know the number, but I can't tell you, the number of, no kidding, 9/11 type attacks that never happened in our country. It's not a daily occurrence, but it's pretty frequent. There are bad people trying to do bad things to our country, and thank goodness we have great Americans that look beyond their own personal, advantages and become the kind of people that watch and work against these. But I think what makes it less responsive is so much of it is now concentrated, the power is concentrated in Washington. And I would just love to see that change. And I think also the president, and all presidents tend to do this, they bring in as much, because they want to do it faster and, in their view, more efficiently, and that's not what the Constitution says. So, but they do try to take power in without consulting the Congress. And I think right now Congress is starting to shake a little bit and tell the White House we want, whether it's a military issue or tariffs or whatever, we want, hey, Mr. President, you need to come to us. We don't work for you. You need to come to us and make your case. So I think I see it kind of going in the right direction, my personal belief. What makes the Marine Corps best? No. What makes U.S. military best? We have the best young men and women that come in, and we have institutions, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space Force, and I would even include, again, the three-letter agencies, CIA, DIA, FBI. We have incredibly talented, committed young people that go into those organizations when they could go somewhere else and make a lot of money, and at least for a time, serve their country and protect it. And the first question asked, what was it?
How do you balance between getting enough information and
No such thing as a perfect plan. You keep planning until you execute. There's no such thing as, and you can't fall in love with your plan, because as we learned when we invaded Iraq, when General Broadmeadow was the to say the least, the best logistics officer that ever walked the earth. We had the best plan you could imagine. When we crossed the line of departure and went into Iraq, and they began resisting us, that plan went down the toilet. But the thing that we can do so well as U.S. military people is, when you do, we adjust so rapidly, so rapidly. Those are lessons learned from previous wars. But again, we had the perfect plan that when we crossed into Iraq, within half a day, that plan went out the window. So if you fall in love with your own plan, and this is when military forces do that, they lose. You've got to be flexible. By contrast, the Iraqis had a plan that they wouldn't change. And as we did things around them and maneuvered and all, they were easy to take apart. And I don't mean kill, but take apart because they were incapable of adjusting to what we were doing in terms of maneuver, cyber, and a lot of other things. So with that, John, I guess we're done, huh?
Sir, we are. So for the audience, this school does a lot of good stuff. But when you boil our mission down, it comes to what's at the end of our mission. And that's to make moral, patriotic, efficient, and useful citizens for this country. And very importantly, to prepare them for the responsibilities of a citizen of this free republic. And those responsibilities are profound. And when we bring in speakers that have lived the responsibilities of a citizen at the highest levels of our government, the highest levels of our state government, both of them, you can hear echoes from these two leaders, these two citizen leaders, from last year's graduation to today's Todd Lecture Series. I'm talking to all of you out front here right now. I hope you've absorbed some of this. I hope you've absorbed a lot of it, because there are nuggets in here that are critical to the mission of this university and why you're here. All right? These are people, General Kelly is a man who has lived the ideals of what we are trying to do here. And sir, you hit it out of the park. Your lessons truly are profound, and thank you for sharing your experiences with us. Ladies and gentlemen, General Kelly.